we also need to think about what sorts of contexts and structures, institutions, relationships continue to build men up so they can be great, great husbands and great dads in the home.
Yeah, so you hit that broader social structure that both the lack of which I guess puts too much pressure on fathers, both to be this sole like positive influence, especially in the lives of their boys, and then to be sort of isolated himself in trying to do it. You know, we used to have all these organizations that sort of provided that, even though we'd suburbanized and we had the factories and things. We also had, you know, Robert Putnam's bowling leagues and the Masons and all of these things that brought men together, and they seem to have disappeared. I guess, do you have any thoughts on like why those disappeared? Like why did men abandon those organizations? Was there something else going on?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So if people want to see a great example of this, you can read the history of the dinner clubs in New York City. These private dinner clubs. And this was a third space. I think what we're talking about is that men don't have a third space.
Right.
Right. A space between work and home where they can find camaraderie and encouragement and vulnerability and all the things that make them great dads and great men. They don't have a third space. Those third spaces, like you said, I think in fairness, disappeared. And if you watch the history of these private dinner clubs in New York City, and by the way, these were not, these were sort of socially virtuous societies. They weren't brothels, right? I mean, yes, those should be dismantled. These weren't places where men were being licentious. It was really a place for men to make connection. These private dinner clubs. There were two big things historically that began to deteriorate those. And we began to see the decline of some of these institutions, I think, in the spirit of egalitarianism and diversity. So on the one hand, there was the introduction of racial diversity and really forcing many of these institutions cosmetically to diversify, when in fact, many of these institutions were built around friendships and social networks, right? It's not that many, and in fairness, some of them most certainly most certainly did not want to integrate. But the idea that you're going to force an institution to integrate outside of social connection and network was an experiment that failed. You couple that, sort of the next phase would be one of the waves of the feminist movement. I don't know what wave it would have been in the 1960s. Sometimes it's hard to know how you count those waves. But there was a movement, right, to introduce these sort of egalitarian spaces. And again, well-intended, right? Do we want a racially diverse third space for men? Yes, absolutely. Do we want a space that doesn't discriminate and treat women poorly? Absolutely. But the consequence of those movements is that it slowly deteriorated and dismantled the sorts of social networks and connections that, now check this out, working class and middle class men maintained. Mm-hmm. The wealthy class maintained their country clubs, right? Mm-hmm. So here's the difference. Some of these societies, some of these institutions like the Kiwanis Club, etc., these were working class versions, right? Middle class and working class versions of the country club. And so once those things, by those movements, began to become more diverse, added on to some of the geographical changes as people moved out from these institutions into the suburbs, they slowly begin to deteriorate, because now you're driving in 20 minutes, you're driving in 30 minutes to meet at this place that wasn't what it was when your father was there, mm-hmm. or when your grandfather was there. Now, again, making these places more diverse wasn't the problem. The problem is there was no new third space created, mm-hmm. right? There was no new place for these men to find connection and community and camaraderie and encouragement. As iron sharpens iron, so does one man sharpen another. Those third spaces actually weren't created in the wake of diversifying some of these. And you see this in New York in particular, because some of these dinner clubs that were exclusive began to decline, and they began to decline so much they had to open up their membership now to middle class people like me. Mm-hmm. Right. So I was able to join the Princeton Club when I lived in New York, and I was trying to figure out why that was. Well, at the Princeton Club, they opened up the Princeton Club to about a dozen or so other universities. I'm a Fordham alum, so as a Fordham alum, I got to join the club. I think if you're a Michigan alum, there was Ohio State, St. Andrews. There were a few of these. Their membership had declined so much they had to open it up to regular non-elite people like me. And if you look at the Union League Club, if you look at all these clubs around New York City, these former exclusive dinner societies, that's where you began to see that decline began in the 1950s. And again, if you look at the 70s and 80s, particularly with working class and lower middle class and middle class communities, those same movements of diversifying those institutions, introducing some more egalitarianism, began to unfortunately undermine the interests in what those institutions used to do in the lives of men. And we never created a third space. And then on top of that, this will be my last point, we redefined what it meant to be a good husband and father and domesticated it, and exclusively made it within the four walls of the home. And so men don't have any friends anymore, and they don't have any institutions because they're made to feel guilty that you're an irresponsible father if you leave your home to go have fun and fellowship and community with a bunch of other guys. You add all those things together, and you get bowling alone, right? Mm-hmm. You get the guy who just goes to Home Depot, comes home and works on his house, and doesn't have any friends. Like, that's what happens when all those things began to decline in the 70s in particular.
I want to come back to this idea of male third spaces in a little bit, because it's really important. Before we do